A curious crusade that sweeps the nation.
He suggested that dogs wear dresses and that cows wear moo-moos.
The mystery behind the worst video game of all time.
This was one of the most infamous myths of the computer age.
And a top-secret plan hidden in plain sight.
What he accomplished helped win World War II.
Deep in the vaults of the world's greatest institutions lie extraordinary relics, tales of intrigue and wonder, and secrets waiting to be revealed.
These are the mysteries at the museum.
Los Angeles, California is known as the movie capital of the world, but it also offers an array of other cultural pursuits. The city boasts over 300 museums, more than any other in the country. And among them is perhaps LA's quirkiest institution, the Velveteria. Its unique collection features over 2,000 works of art, all painted on velvet. These pieces honor such notable figures as Dolly Parton, Alfred Hitchcock, and even President Abraham Lincoln. But as filmmaker Jenny Abel can attest, there's one item that is weirder than all the rest.
It's approximately 3 by 2 feet with a black background. And I don't think that a painting exists like this anywhere else on Earth. It's a depiction of a unicorn that's wearing shorts.
This seemingly whimsical image is actually a testament to one of the strangest political movements the nation has ever seen.
This piece of art was created to honor one man's quest to clothe every single naked animal across the United States of America.
The early 1960s. It's an era of great social change. Young Americans are embracing a new culture of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But not everyone is happy about this shifting moral code. Conservatives denounce what they see as a rising tide of promiscuity and subversion. And it's in this divisive time that a new champion of conservative ideals emerges. On August 21st, 1962, citizens across the nation turn on their TVs and see the venerable CBS News anchor, Walter Cronkite, interviewing a man named G. Clifford Prout. The young guest claims he's identified the root of the country's social ills. He thinks the problem lies with naked animals.
Prout believed that animal nudity was an absolute moral disaster that led to social problems. Children growing up, forming gangs, doing drugs.
To eradicate these problems, Prout declares that these immodest creatures must be properly dressed.
He suggested that any animal that stood higher than 4 inches or longer than 6 inches wear jumpsuits, that dogs wear dresses, and that cows wear moo-moos.
The activist tells Cronkite he's even formed an organization called the Society for Indecency to Naked Animals. To most, Prout's ideas sound ludicrous, but America's Puritans latch on to this unlikely new hero. And Prout's movement takes off. Independent chapters of his society spring up across the country. And within the year, it claims a membership of 50,000 strong. Activists create slogans, strategize ways to advance their cause, and even stage high-profile demonstrations.
In Northern California, a small plane manned by a pilot was airdropping clothing for the animals on various farms.
But that's not all. On March 5th, 1963, the group marches on the White House. Their target, the Kennedys' presidential pet horse, Macaroni.
They were very upset that Macaroni was naked, and they demanded that Macaroni be clothed for the sake of decency.
With each outlandish event, the movement turns into a cultural phenomenon.
Thousands and thousands of articles appeared across the nation. The society was even arousing interest globally.
But as support for this bizarre cause builds, so does media scrutiny. Reporters begin to suspect that the society might not be everything it's cooked up to be.
There was something a little fishy about the Society for Indecency to Naked Animals.
Journalists at Time magazine investigate the society and make a stunning discovery. On March 15th, the publication reports that the group's president, G. Clifford Prout, isn't who he says he is.
Time magazine revealed G. Clifford Prout Jr. was actually a comedy actor named Buck Henry.
As word gets out, the press descends on Buck Henry. And under the weight of heavy media attention, the comedian is forced to confess.
He held his hands up in the air and he said that it was a joke. I need to come clean. I can't do this anymore.
Henry explains that back in 1959, he and another comic named Alan Abel set out to satirize conservatives' values. And so, the Society for Indecency to Naked Animals was born. To Henry's astonishment, many puritanical Americans took the ruse seriously. Spying an opportunity to make a big splash, Henry happily took his hoax to the next level.
He couldn't believe that people didn't see it was a joke. It took on a life of its own.
When the Society's supporters learn the truth, they are appalled.
People wanted to believe, and when it didn't exist anymore, they just felt so saddened. There were thousands and thousands of angry letters. People were really upset.
In the wake of this high-profile scandal, Buck Henry's career takes off.
He wrote The Graduate, he wrote Get Smart, he appeared on Saturday Night Live, and he went on to great fame.
His swindle goes down as one of history's greatest practical jokes. And today, this painting on display at LA's Velveteria recalls the outrageous campaign that may have taken the call for modesty a little too far. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania boasts a rich legacy as a center for the healing arts. This is the home of the nation's first hospital. In fact, 1 out of every 6 doctors in the U.S. is trained in the city of brotherly love. And showcasing the more macabre side of the field is the Mutter Museum. Inside, visitors can examine amputation devices from the Civil War, preserved human limbs, and a death cast of Chang and Eng, whose conjoined condition inspired the term Siamese twins. But amongst these medical marvels is an artifact that was long shrouded in mystery and misconception.
You can clearly make out that it has 2 eyes, there's a recognizable nose, you can see a jaw and a mouth on it, but it looks a little unusual at the top of the head. It's kind of shocking if you haven't seen something like this before.
According to folklore writer Peter Muse, this unusual skull is linked to tales of strange creatures that once terrified the nation.
This is sort of a classic campfire story that you might tell your friends on a dark summer night to scare them.
So what's the truth behind accounts of bizarre entities in the American countryside? It's the 1980s, Fairfield, Connecticut. According to legend, a group of high school girls is out for a drive when they decide to explore the nearby woods. Suddenly, they spot something in the distance.
They saw these shapes in the woods starting to move towards them.
The bizarre figures appear to be unlike anything they've seen before.
It looked like they were small, maybe 3 or 4 feet high. They had really enlarged, bulbous heads, very disproportionate with their bodies.
The girls flee in terror. Back in town, they tell others of the incident. But it seems they're not the first to encounter these odd creatures. In fact, stories of bulbous-headed beings have been around for decades.
Some people said that they lived out in the woods, out in abandoned farmland. Some stories say they will eat you. Other stories say they might abduct you if you encounter them.
Despite the varied accounts, the odd beings all share a distinctive feature and are soon given a name.
Because of these disproportionately sized heads, people in the area called them melon heads.
So who are these mysterious beings? And where did they come from?
It's the 1600s in Connecticut. Residents claim they've seen something strange in the woods. Small, human-like figures with oversized heads. So what's the truth behind these bizarre reports?
Some believe their existence can be traced to the 1600s. At the time, Connecticut's Puritan community is swept up in a wave of hysteria over witches. According to this theory, a local family had been banished to the woods for witchcraft. At first, everyone assumed they had died, but that might not have been the case.
Some people said that the family survived and their children inbred with each other, and that inbreeding created the physical and possibly mental mutations, which in many cases enlarged their heads.
So could these strange beings really be the descendants of witches? Over time, a more scientific explanation emerges. A rare medical condition called hydrocephalus. The disease typically affects infants and children.
The term comes from Greek hydro, meaning water, cephalus, meaning head. And as children are born with this ailment, they have fluids in their brain and in their skull, and it creates a large bulbous head.
Some have argued that stories of bulbous-headed creatures could have originated from people seeing children with this condition, and that over time, the stories spun out of control, creating the legend of the melonheads.
Someone may have seen someone with hydrocephalus and not understood the condition and made up a story about them.
Today, there's a range of treatments available for those afflicted with hydrocephalus. And this skull, which shows its effects, remains on display at the Mutter Museum. It stands as an example of how sometimes science can put a tall tale to rest. The city of Alamogordo, New Mexico, is the gateway to the spectacular White Sands National Monument. These snow-colored dunes span 275 square miles of the Chihuahuan Desert and are considered to be one of the world's great natural wonders. And just a few miles east of this majestic expanse is one of the area's other star attractions, the New Mexico Museum of Space History. Its collection includes a rocket propulsion test sled, a slice of moon rock, and a full-size replica of the first satellite to orbit the Earth, Sputnik. But hidden among the towering tributes to space is a more diminutive earthly item.
It's a small plastic casing, black, and it's about 3 inches by 4 inches. It looks like it's been damaged, and there's a label on the front with the bright red word Atari on it.
According to museum director Christopher Orwell, this beat-up cartridge spawned one of pop culture's biggest mysteries.
What has been called one of the worst video games ever was behind one of the most infamous myths of the computer age.
It's December 1982. 12-year-old Mike Burns is an avid video game fan. And like many players, he's excited to get his hands on this Christmas's most hotly anticipated title, a game from Atari based on the blockbuster film E.T.
This game was really the first time a gaming company was trying to do a significant tie-in with a successful movie. In this case, Steven Spielberg's Extraterrestrial, or E.T.
But when Mike plugs in his copy, he's sorely disappointed. The game seems terrible.
There was a lot of frustration. He didn't enjoy the game.
And he's not alone. Thousands of kids across the country agree, and even bestow E.T. with a dubious honor.
This game is considered the worst video game in history.
As word of the awful game spreads, Atari's sales are hit hard. In the end, the company sells just 20% of the cartridge manufactured.
Many copies were actually returned afterwards, and they were sitting in storage in warehouses throughout the United States.
Within a year, Atari halts distribution of the game. And in 1984, Atari itself is sold off by its parent company. But that's not the end of the story. In the decades following Atari's collapse, the worst video game ever made gains cult status. Nerds everywhere are desperate to play the title that brought down the industry juggernaut. But there's a problem. Despite Atari manufacturing a reported 5 million copies, strangely, only a few remain. Gamers everywhere wonder what happened to the millions of unsold cartridges. Before long, a bizarre rumor begins to swirl. So embarrassed by the game's failure, Atari went to great lengths to bury it. Literally.
A lot of people think that the ET cartridges were buried in a dump near Roswell in the early 1980s.
Atari denies the rumors, but the story refuses to die. Over the years, the tale of a video game cache hidden in the desert takes on a near mythical status, leading the value of the few cartridges that do remain to skyrocket. If the legend of the buried games is true, and if the site could be discovered, it would earn whoever finds it a place in gaming history. In 2014, one man sets out to uncover the answer. Someone still haunted by the game. Mike Burns. Now a successful business owner in California, Mike vows to find the buried stash.
Mike's got a passion for it, and so he really wants to find out if the rumors are true.
So can Mike dig up the truth behind the worst video game ever made?
It's 2014, Alamogordo, New Mexico. Video game fan Mike Burns is on a quest to prove an urban legend. After critics slammed E.T. as the worst video game ever, its manufacturer, Atari, allegedly buried a huge cache of unsold cartridges in the desert. So, will Burns dig up the truth, or is this game over?
Mike starts cold calling landfills across the American Southwest.
He is asking kind of a strange question. Do you know anything about a burial of video games back in 1983?
After dozens of calls, he gets a hit in Alamogordo, New Mexico.
So on one of the cold calls, he finds a staff member who answers up that, yeah, he was the landfill operator back in the early 1980s. And yes, there were some odd things that were brought in 1983 and buried there at the landfill.
Burns flies to Alamogordo. He enlists the help of the landfill's employees and pinpoints where in the 300-acre site the cartridges are most likely to be stashed.
They think they've got it narrowed down now to an exact spot.
On April 26, 2014, hundreds of spectators arrive at the landfill outside Alamogordo to witness history.
There was an electric excitement. You had gamers from all over the United States and actually all over the world. Never in a million years would I have expected to see a large line of people waiting to get into a dump.
As the excavation begins, Mike watches with bated breath.
It was windy. The dust was blowing everywhere. It was like, you ever seen Raiders of the Lost Ark?
For hours, bulldozers dig up giant mounds of dirt. Then, a little after 12 p.m., they uncover something in one of the piles of debris.
Sitting right in the middle was, take a wild guess. No kidding. It was an ET game cartridge.
The team ultimately unearths 1,300 ET game cartridges at the site.
Mike was ecstatic. He proved that the urban legend was actually true. ET'd come home.
Today, this damaged cartridge on display at the New Mexico Museum of Space History endures as a testament to this tale of a fabled burial and the quest to dig up the truth. San Diego, California is known as the Gibraltar of the Pacific for its critical role in the country's military operations. It is home to the largest Navy and Marine Corps complex in the United States. And a few miles inland is an institution that explores this history, the San Diego Air and Space Museum. Inside, visitors can find a 1928 Ford tri-motor passenger plane, a Vietnam-era Huey helicopter, and a Boeing GPS-12 satellite. But there is one item in the collection which, although intimately linked to aviation, never left the ground.
It's quite old. It smells like rubber and string. There's some brown, there's some green. It's about 20 feet by 20 feet of mystery.
According to archivist Mark Aldrich, this object defended the nation during one of its darkest hours.
This artifact is linked to an amazing World War II story of confusion and deception.
How did this strange relic protect the U.S. homeland? February 23rd, 1942. 2 months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, a Japanese submarine launches another attack on U.S. soil, firing on an oil field just outside of Santa Barbara, California.
These attacks on the West Coast were a reminder to the American population that the war was real and could reach our shores.
In the wake of the assault, the American military fears the Japanese will strike again, and that this time they will attack from the air. Officials realize munitions plants along the West Coast are potential targets, putting U.S. forces in a vulnerable position.
The factories in Southern California were churning out vast quantities of aircraft for the war effort. Any type of damage you can cause to that production capacity runs the risk of extending the war or even swinging it.
The fate of the free world is at stake. The military assigns an Army engineer named Colonel John F. Omer to protect the factories at any cost. But it's a tall order.
Aircraft factories are not small. They're making big things. They're making big airplanes, bombers. They could be over 1 million square feet with over 14,000 employees.
The engineer concludes that to defend the massive compounds with anti-aircraft missiles would likely prove ineffective. He needs a more unconventional approach. He finds inspiration in his personal life.
John Omer was an engineer, and he was a tinkerer, and he had some other interesting hobbies, including magic.
He comes up with a seemingly impossible idea. Perhaps there's a way to make the munitions plants disappear.
He pitched the idea to the War Department, and it was really quite extraordinary.
What bizarre plan does Omer have up his sleeve?
It's the 1940s in California. After the Japanese launch a terrifying strike on a U.S. mainland facility, Army Colonel John F. Omer is charged with safeguarding munitions factories from future attacks. These sprawling complexes are so big, they're almost impossible to defend. So how will Omer protect his country?
The inventive engineer sets out to create one of history's greatest illusions. In order to safeguard the plants, he'll make them disappear. If the buildings were to blend in with the landscape, they'd be invisible to enemy planes.
Omer's aim was to hide the factories from the Japanese so that they're not going to know where to drop their bombs.
The sprawling complexes encompass buildings, runways, and fields. So concealing them is a massive task.
Where do you go for help? Where do you get advice? You go to Hollywood, of course.
Omer recruits an army of artists, set designers, and painters from movie studios such as Disney and Paramount. The team then gets to work on transforming Lockheed Martin's Burbank plant, one of the most strategic military facilities in the U.S. They cover the complex with a giant canopy of painted canvas and camouflage netting, like this one on display at the San Diego Air and Space Museum.
Imagine just covering 1 million square feet with canvas and then building fake buildings on top of it, painting roads, painting lawns. There were houses, there were churches, the fake trees, even though they were only about 4 feet tall. From the air, they looked real.
Omer's team even makes sure the neighborhood shows signs of life.
They would move the cars around so that there was some sense of motion. They even had fake smoke coming out of the chimneys, just so it would look like someone was home.
When test flights are conducted over the facility to assess the disguise, the results are stunning. The pilots report that from above, there's no sign of factories on the ground.
The level of detail was extraordinary, and from the air, it was really convincing.
Omer's techniques are soon implemented by munitions facilities all along the West Coast. The disguised factories are never bombed by Japanese planes. With production uninterrupted, the facilities churn out nearly 2/3 of the Allied forces' military equipment.
I suspect Omer was flushed with pride. What he accomplished helped win World War II.
Today, this piece of camouflage netting sits on display at the San Diego Air and Space Museum. It recalls the ingenious plan of one man who proved that sometimes the best strategy is hiding in plain sight. St. Augustine, Florida. Founded as a Spanish colony in 1565, it's the nation's oldest city. Visitors can enjoy breathtaking beaches, exquisite Spanish architecture, and ancient military forts. Yet charting the darker side of the area's history is the St. Augustine Pirate and Treasure Museum. Its exhibits include a collection of antique cannons, an 18th century cutlass, and a blunderbuss firearm that belonged to the infamous pirate Blackbeard. But amongst these antique weapons of war is an object that, at first glance, appears harmless.
This amazing relic is made of old wood on the outside. On the inside, it's lined with 17th century newspaper and pages from books. This artifact was once owned by an infamous rogue from the golden age of piracy, Captain William Kidd.
As museum chairman Pat Croce explains, this relic is linked to an epic crusade for fame and fortune.
The owner of this chest sparked a centuries-old quest for buried treasure.
(1701), London, England. Notorious pirate Captain William Kidd has been captured by the British and sentenced to death.
Captain Kidd was always renowned as a very successful pirate. He captured ships laden with spices and silver and jewels.
But Kidd's most infamous act is still to come. On the day of his execution, he makes a stunning announcement.
When he was hung at Execution Dock, he alleged he buried hidden treasure.
But before he can reveal the location of his riches, the pirate is executed, leaving a legacy that is shrouded in mystery.
Everyone wonders, where was that treasure?
For more than a century, treasure hunters search for Kidd's fortune, but their efforts are all in vain. Most conclude that Kidd's final proclamation was nothing more than bravado. But then, at the turn of the 19th century, the legend is reborn. 1803, Nova Scotia. 26-year-old Daniel McGinnis has heard rumors that Captain Kidd's prized loot is buried on a small stretch of land just off Nova Scotia called Oak Island.
He wanted to follow the rumor and prove it to be true.
McGinnis searches the island, and as he pushes his way through the thick undergrowth, something catches his eye. A seemingly man-made clearing with an unusual circular depression in the ground.
He grabs his buddies and says, "We're digging here. X marks the spot."
McGinnis and his pals get to work. They dig all through the day and reach 60 feet deep. Then suddenly,
they hit wood. So they start moving the dirt. Is it a treasure chest? No, it's like a plank, like a wood floor. And it's lined with coconut fiber. There's no coconut anywhere near Nova Scotia. That's in the Caribbean, 1,000 miles away.
The only way that coconuts could get to Oak Island would be if someone brought them there from a tropical land. someone like Captain Kidd. With this discovery, McGinnis and his friends are convinced they're on the right track. But there's a problem. It's too late in the day to dig any deeper.
It's so dark out they can't see anything, so they climb out of the hole.
But the next morning, when they return to the pit, they're met with a disaster.
They go down the ladder. It's flooded.
The men are baffled. With no rain overnight and the ocean 500 feet away, there's no logical explanation as to why the pit could have flooded. Nevertheless, McGinnis and his team attempt to drain the water. But it's no use.
They don't have the technology. They don't have the funds to pump the water back out. They never figure out what's flooding the pit, nor if their treasure is there.
As news of McGinnis's discovery spreads, other fortune hunters converge on Oak Island. But they all meet the same fate. Each time they dig, the pit mysteriously fills with water, stopping them in their tracks. So what is the cause of this bizarre flooding? And is this really the site of Captain Kidd's buried treasure?
It's the 1800s in Nova Scotia. For over a century, rumors have swirled that the infamous pirate Captain Kidd buried a vast fortune on tiny Oak Island. But every time treasure hunters dig for the loot, the hole mysteriously floods. So what's the truth behind the legend of Oak Island?
As the years go by, a sinister theory emerges that the tiny island is cursed. For centuries, locals have claimed to see inexplicable glowing orbs of light floating around the island.
The people around Oak Island thought there was something mysterious about the island.
So could the ghost of Captain Kidd be haunting Oak Island, protecting his treasure? Others claim there is a more logical explanation. Records suggest that in 1849, one group of treasure hunters made a startling discovery.
They figured that there was a variety of man-made tunnels that allowed water to flow into this treasure trove. Booby traps. If it was true, whoever created this booby trap didn't want what they buried to be found.
Others, however, have dismissed the booby trap theory and say that the bizarre flooding has a perfectly natural cause. The island itself is made of the porous rock limestone. Some geologists believe that the seawater could have eroded the rock, creating an underground waterway leading to the pit. The truth, it seems, remains a mystery. Efforts to confirm the existence of these tunnels, natural or not, continue to this day.
Everyone wants treasure. There's something down at the bottom of that pit. Is it Captain Kidd's? No one knows, but still there for the taking.
Today, this chest, once owned by the legendary Captain William Kidd, is on display at St. Augustine, Florida's Pirate Museum, a reminder of the great lengths or depths people will go to find buried treasure. Stockholm, Sweden. Spread out over 14 islands, this capital city was built over 760 years ago. And located in one of its oldest districts is an institution that celebrates the country's most prestigious tradition, the Nobel Museum. Honoring the winners of this esteemed award, the museum's collection includes fungus samples that led to Alexander Fleming's invention of penicillin, and eyeglasses worn by the Dalai Lama. But perhaps the museum's most prized possession is the artifact that started it all.
It is a quite extraordinary piece of paper. It's 11 by 17 inch, handwritten, and it really reflects a man's visions and ideas.
This time-worn manuscript speaks to the birth of the Nobel Prize itself. But as director Olav Amelin attests, few realize that the award's creation stemmed from one man's bizarre brush with his own mortality.
The words on these pages change human history, but they were almost never written.
1866, Sweden. 32-year-old chemist Alfred Nobel is a fiercely competitive inventor and entrepreneur.
Alfred Nobel was quite talented. He was also very ambitious, and I think that was really one of the driving forces.
Nobel is working on a product he thinks will net him a fortune. An explosive made from the highly volatile chemical nitroglycerin.
There's a big demand for explosives for construction works, and it was also something that you could use for military purposes. If he could make nitroglycerin explode in a controlled manner, he could make a fortune out of this.
Nobel combines liquid nitroglycerin with fine-grained sand to create a paste. This substance can then be shaped into sticks that are safe to handle. It's the breakthrough he's been seeking.
And so he patented his new invention, and he named it after this Greek word that means power or force. Dynamite.
Dynamite is an immediate success. Construction companies use it to blast tunnels and cut canals. And governments around the world order large quantities to produce arms and munitions.
It became really important in developing really efficient weapons. Once he had his new invention, his career took off.
Over the ensuing decades, Alfred Nobel becomes one of the most successful scientists of his time.
He was running almost 100 factories all over the world, and he became, of course, extremely rich.
But then, in April 1888, his world is flipped upside down.
He had the surprise of his life. This is the moment that may have changed the history of the world.
It's 1888. Chemist Alfred Nobel has achieved fame and fortune through his invention of dynamite.
But one day, he makes an explosive discovery
that will forever reshape his legacy.
In April, Nobel is reading a newspaper when he sees something startling. His own obituary.
He was quite surprised. To read your own obituary must have been a shock.
Nobel realizes that the papers have just made a mistake, confusing him with his brother Ludwig, who had died just days earlier. But it's not this innocent mix-up that leaves him unnerved. Rather, it's the contents of the article itself. It calls him the Merchant of Death. Nobel is stunned.
I don't think that it occurred to him that he would be remembered as someone who had invented something very destructive. And so he starts to worry about what he's going to leave behind.
Nobel's very notion of himself is now put in a new light. He vows to rewrite his legacy. In 1895, the scientist pens a handwritten will, a replica of which is now on display at the Nobel Museum.
He realized that he was super rich, and he wanted to do something great with his money.
The document states that upon his passing, a new prize shall be created. It will recognize those who contribute to the positive advancement of humanity in the fields of physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and perhaps most importantly, peace. The bequest is seen as Nobel's ultimate attempt to make amends for the devastation wrought by dynamite.
I definitely think that the Peace Prize is a counterbalance to him developing technology for warfare.
A year after writing his will, Nobel passes away. In accordance with his wishes, a foundation is formed and awards the first prizes in 1901.
The Nobel Prize today is probably the most prestigious prize you can get.
This replica of the will that inspired the eponymous prize sits on display at the Nobel Museum. It ensures a tribute to the venerated genius, whose name is synonymous with the best of humanity. From a crazy crusade to a camouflage cover-up, a prestigious prize to buried treasure,
I'm Don Wildman, and these are the mysteries at the museum.